Well, the Texans have drafted, the draft has passed, and so now instead of talking about what the Texans should do with these picks, let's talk about what the Texans did do with these picks.
To throw the punches on. He floats one wide open, and there he goes! Tagged down for a Texan touchdown.
Overall, I'm pretty happy with what the Texans did in this draft. I said it several times beforehand, and I'll say it again. A lot of the target needs in this draft were depth related, and a lot of them could have gone without being addressed at all, and I probably would have been fine with it. I mean, the Texans are in an excellent spot. Nick Caserio said it going into the draft. This team was ready to play a game before the draft started, so anything added is just icing on the cake. Outside of Kamari Laster and possibly Kalen Bullock, I don't know if the Texans really added any starters. Like I said, it's just depth. One thing that might be kind of important to address, maybe not, it depends on how analytical you are, is that the Texans ranked 31st out of 32 teams in terms of relative athletic score. For those unfamiliar, the relative athletic score is something posted by, I believe the user is MathBomb on Twitter. It's been posted for a while now, and it just combines relative to the position, how a player performs based off of 40 time, all those metrics that are the measurables, and decides if a player has a relatively high athletic score relative to other players overall, throughout history, I guess. So the Texans have never been one since Nick Caserio took over to really care about measurables and stuff like that. So it's unsurprising, especially with the second round pick being Kamari Laster, who ran a 4.640, that the Texans didn't do incredibly well when it came to relative athletic score with this draft class. Speaking of Kamari Laster, let's just go ahead and get right into a pick-by-pick run-through of how the Texans did in this year's draft. Now, Kamari Laster, like I said, ran a 4.6 and I think that's what a lot of people are fixating on. If you really are concerned about that, though, then there's at least one player who started in the league for a significant amount of time, is considered to be a pretty good corner that you probably wouldn't like, and that's Rondé Barber. Rondé Barber, I believe, ran a 4.68. His relative athletic score was not great, and so if you're fixating on 40 time, then you're not doing what Nick Caserio is doing. As I've said, he watches the film, and if you watch the film, you can see in several instances where Kamari Laster keeps up with receivers that run far faster 40 time than him. It's more about game speed than film speed. So Kamari Laster has the game speed, so I'm not necessarily concerned about his 40 time. Where does Kamari Laster fit? Well, potentially outside. He could be an outside corner. I think a lot of people view him as a nickel because of his 40 time, but I think he does legitimately contend to be the opposite corner, replacing Steven Nelson, who has not re-signed with anyone else, but is not re-signed with the Texans at the moment. You've got Sting, Lassiter, and then we'll talk about the nickel position later in the draft, because believe it or not, there's a draft pick later in the draft that does affect that discussion potentially. Now, understanding that Lassiter's biggest competition for the outside corner position as the roster stands is Okudah and Henderson, it's ideal that Lassiter wins out because Okudah and Henderson are on one-year deals, and if they perform and show up as outside corners this year, I don't know if the Texans are going to be looking to pay them all that much money to keep them around. So it's ideal to develop this. This pick is really the biggest starter pick for the Texans. It's not really meant to be a depth pick. I like it a lot, and I like what I've seen from Lassiter, not just on the field, but in videos since the draft happened. His attitude and the way he is as a person, I think, is going to mesh really well with this Texans team. He's got the swarm mentality for sure. And it doesn't hurt that he played in the SEC. The fact that the Texans picked at 42 and 59, the picks that they brought into the draft instead of trading up or down from them, is not the only surprising thing that happened in the second round. At the 59th overall pick, the Texans selected Blake Fisher, a tackle out of Notre Dame, and there were a lot of things that could have made this pick make more sense in the short term, like maybe flexibility to guard, but Blake Fisher didn't play anything but right tackle and then some left tackle throughout his college career. So it raises the question of why go tackle so high in the draft? Personally, I'm someone who looks at Laramie Tunsil and Titus Howard and goes, the Texans are pretty well set at tackle, and so maybe we should wait till later in the draft to address that position. But Caserio, in his way, has players that he likes, that he thinks fits well, and I think this might actually speak volumes to how the team views the Texans' woes in terms of injuries on the offensive line, even at tackle, specifically with Titus Howard. And so it's less surprising when you think about it over time, but initially I was a little shocked with this pick. I like it with the time I've had to process it since. I mean, it's a little high to go to get a swing tackle who could eventually become a starter, but with how badly the Texans needed the swing tackle to eventually become the starter last season, I hate the pick less and less as time goes on. So overall, not a lot to say about it. I mean, except for that it was shocking initially, but I've come around to the fact that Blake Fisher is probably a really good pickup for the team, given the situation that we went through last year. In the third round, the Texans selected Kalen Bullock, and this is where we have that discussion about nickel versus safety. Kalen Bullock is a safety. He's a free safety, and so is Jimmy Ward. So you ask yourself, why spend a third-round pick on a safety that doesn't solve? A lot of people's concern with the safety position revolves around Jalen Petrie. If you're a Texans fan and you've looked at that room, a lot of people saying the Texans needed safety help were looking specifically at Jalen Petrie, though I will say there was a contingent that was looking at Jimmy Ward's health and going, maybe we need to address depth at that position. Now, given that in the past, Jimmy Ward has been accused of not wanting to play nickel, I did do some research. Jimmy Ward never said that he didn't want to play nickel with the 49ers. He told them that he was interested in doing it as someone who is interested in helping the team in any way that he can. He had brought the idea up and was told no. And then when the 49ers nickel went down, he was forced into nickel without any of the proper preparation. And as anyone can probably relate to, when you are forced to do anything without given the proper time to prepare for it, it probably would frustrate you just a little bit. And I think it showed this past year with the Texans in the time that Jimmy Ward played, that he played a significant amount more nickel, and we never heard him complain about how it wasn't something he wanted to do. He was more than willing to do what was needed in order to help the team. So with that in mind, there are some people that will tell you that Jimmy Ward looks really good as a nickel, and maybe the Texans drafted Kalen Bullock to potentially start at free safety. I would say Kalen Bullock is a boom or bust prospect, and that if he shows his full potential in the time that they give him to play safety, maybe that could be something down the line, but I don't see him immediately taking over as the starting free safety. Granted, I'm not there, I'm not in the room, so take that for what you will. But I do really like the pick. Watching his film, he had a significant amount of interceptions. He got in there and got after it in college. My wife is a USC fan, so I did watch a significant amount of USC football, considering her side of the family is really into USC. And him and a later pick in the draft, Bird, are really good pickups, really good additions to this Texans team. So to recap, I think Bullock could push for a starting role. I don't know if I see him immediately being a starter on the team, but I do like the pick for depth, which is going to be the theme pretty much for the rest of the draft. Peaches and Herb once said, reunited and it feels so good, and that's how CJ Stroud and Cade Stover have to feel after this fourth round pick. Cade Stover at tight end at 123. It was an interesting way the Texans took to get to this pick, since they had 123, traded it away, and then traded back up to 123 to make this pick. But I do really like the pick of Cade Stover, tight end out of Ohio State, for the Texans at 123. I look at the Texans tight end room, I see Dalton Schultz, Brevin Jordan, and you add Cade Stover. I don't think it's overly crowded, but I do think that maybe TQ, maybe some of the other guys that have filled depth roles for this team are looking to fight a little harder for a roster spot with the addition of Cade Stover. Looking at Cade Stover himself, there's been some concern about his ability to block. I think a lot of Texans fans looked to this draft to pick up a tight end who could block, since we already have Brevin Jordan and Dalton Schultz who can catch, but have accusations that they allegedly cannot block. And so picking up Cade Stover is interesting from that perspective, but Cade Stover has already pretty head-on addressed those accusations throughout the combine process, and so I think, and looking at what film I've seen of him, it doesn't seem like it's an issue, but there are probably some Ohio State fans out there that'll tell me that it was. I think that as a depth piece, I'm not super concerned about that. It's something that can develop. He's played defensive end for Ohio State at one point, so I feel like as a prospect who has that versatile skill set that we can expect him to probably develop into a better blocker as he plays more with the Texans. And even if we don't see much from Stover in 2024, Brevin Jordan's time in Houston is up. If he doesn't decide to re-sign after the 2024 season, 2025, we would have that tight end 2 behind Schultz already lined up, and we wouldn't really have to worry about addressing that. We'd have a guy who has really good chemistry with CJ Stroud and has already had a year in the system. So yeah, I mean, overall, really love the pick. I think that this was a draft where the Texans were going to have the luxury of making picks that didn't necessarily fit a perceived need for the team. And so this, in essence, is one of those picks, depending on how you view it. And so yeah, overall, I really like the pick. The Texans skipped round 5. They didn't have a 5th round pick going into the draft, and they did not bother to try and procure one at any point in the draft. So in the 6th round, at the 188th pick, which is another pick they had going into the draft and did not make any effort to trade or move on from, they drafted Jamal Hill, a linebacker out of Oregon. If you've watched this channel for any extended period of time, you will know I listed linebacker as the top need for the Texans. And so you're asking, James, how do you feel about waiting till the 6th round to address linebacker? I'll say this, the Texans, they had interviews over Zoom with this linebacker. They seem to like him. He could be a contributor on special teams. I said it at the beginning. I'll say it again. The Texans didn't need to address any of the needs that I listed before the draft in order to become better as a team. They were ready to play football in 2024 without this draft. And so I'm not bummed that they decided to go against maybe an Edrin Cooper or a Jeremiah Trotter type and that they waited this long. I hope that Jamal Hill, produces not only on special teams, but finds a way to get on the field. Otherwise, I'm prepared for the Christian Harris, Aneez Al-Shaair, and, Henry To'oTo'o linebacking group with the depth that the team has to take the field in 2024. Overall, I mean, like I said, all I have to go on with this particular prospect is just the videos of him that came out on social media as he was drafted. He seems ready to get to work, and I have no reason to believe that I'm going to do anything but love this prospect on the Texans. Speaking of a prospect that I think I'm going to love on the Texans, the next 6th round pick the Texans had at 205, they took Jawar Jordan. And I'll tell you this, I had not heard of Jawar Jordan before the draft. There was 2 other Louisville running backs, one of which had visited with the Texans that I had heard of before him. But I'll tell you, I immediately know that I'm going to love Jawar Jordan on the Texans. Biggest steal of the draft. I don't know if you're on Twitter. I don't know if you've seen it. He's already interacting with the fans. He's already following all the Texans fan pages. He is in it to make his impression known. He thinks he's the biggest steal of the draft. I mean, I would love for him to be, considering that if you've asked any Texans fan for the past year what the Texans' biggest need in the draft is, at least on offense, you'll get the answer that the need is running back or offensive line, depending on the kind of fan you're talking to. So to see the Texans go after running back this late, I think this is the perfect stage. It shows that the Texans have some faith in Dameon Pierce, but they also, bringing back Dario Obungawale and bringing in Jawar Jordan, I think creates the mesh that the Texans are going to need, on top of bringing in Joe Mixon to start. So I feel a lot better about the Texans running back room going into this season with this pick, with all the moves that have happened over this offseason coming together and culminating in what we're seeing in the Texans running back room right now. You can never get enough defensive linemen, and as I mentioned earlier, Solomon Byrd out of USC was who the Texans took with the 238th pick, their first pick in the 7th round. And I was surprised to see them hang on to all 3 picks in the 7th round, but I do like all 3 picks that they made in the 7th round. Now, Solomon Byrd led the Pac-12 in pressures at, I believe it was 22, and I mean, he just showed up. There was plays with Kalen Bullock where the pressure he put on the quarterback allowed Bullock to make the interceptions they needed. I don't think he's immediately going to get on the field and be a contributor as a 7th-round pick. I don't think anyone does, but I mean, if he does, I would be all for it. I'm here for it. Late round picks contributing is how GMs make Super Bowl contenders. So I like the pick. I think that it brings great depth to a position that some might say doesn't need it, but I mean, you can never have enough rushers. So I'm all here for the pick. At 247th overall, the Texans selected Marcus Harris, a defensive tackle out of Auburn. And the first need that most Texans fans saw for this team was defensive tackle. Number 1 overall need. They should address this probably in the 2nd round. And Nick Caserio admitted that in the 2nd and 3rd round, they considered taking a defensive tackle. But there was that run on defensive tackles that was started by the Titans selecting Tavondre Sweat. You heard that, right? The Titans did that. Now, I would have loved, if the Texans had selected him at 42, I would have been happy with it. I would have accepted that. There's a certain Titans fan that's not super happy about the pick, but I mean, you got to count your blessings when you get them. That dude is made to play defensive tackle. But I do really like Marcus Harris as the pick. There was a couple of times throughout the draft where I thought the Texans would go defensive tackle. Several times. There was certain players that were rated a lot higher than they went, and there was a few times the Texans had the chance to take defensive tackle. I could go on and on about it. That was really one of the positions that they let slip to the very last second in the draft. In terms of the 4, so the 4 that I had said were probably the biggest needs, whether it's depth or however you view it for the Texans, was linebacker, defensive tackle, cornerback, and safety. They addressed cornerback and safety first, and boy, did they wait on linebacker and defensive tackle. But this guy slipped far past his value, 11 and a half tackles for a loss in 2023. And I mean, I think could immediately fit into the rotation. And if he plays it right, he could carve himself out maybe a more prominent role in the defensive tackle rotation. This is certainly a player who I think people should keep an eye on as probably outplaying his draft position year 1. The Texans' last pick in the draft at 249th overall is Ladarius Henderson, an offensive lineman out of Michigan. And this is the pick I thought they were making in the 2nd round. He's definitely primarily a tackle, but he does have the flexibility to play guard. And I thought that was what the Texans would probably look into with Kenyon Green being in a prove-it year, depending on who you ask. I thought the Texans might be looking to find someone who could be the backup, could flex into a starter. Maybe they view Kendrick Green that way. Who knows? The K Green twins. We'll see how that goes. But I do like this pick from the versatility perspective, and I think that depth is never a bad thing in the trenches. So if he, as a 7th-round pick, all he ever does is provide depth, he's done what was expected of him. And if he comes to the team, steps up and plays any snaps at all as a starter, you either be really concerned or really proud of him. Either way, I don't know. Not much else to say about it but that. And that was the Texans 2024 draft. Now, as far as an overall grade goes, I'm pretty in there with the consensus, which is about a B+. I have trouble going up to even an A- just based off of personal things. Just looking at how the Texans maybe could have done a little bit better, but I think B+ is like you did good, you did above average, but you just didn't like nail the excellency of it. And that'll go up with time if Caserio is who we think he is, right? If what Caserio has done in this draft shows to be what it has since he's been with the Texans, it'll shoot up to an A really easily. But for now, I'm pretty set at a B+, just based off of how certain positions were addressed and just overall what the Texans came away with. But I cannot emphasize enough how excited I am to see this draft class on the field and contributing to the success of this team. As always, I have been James Roy. Thanks for tuning in to this bullpen bit where we've talked about the Texans 2024 draft class. As always, you can find me at M1 Texans fan across all social media. If you like the Texans and are looking for a Texans podcast, Tom and I do the Texans podcast, The Bullpen. This is just a bit, but you can listen to this. You can listen to any of the ramblings we have about the Texans on the Bullpen's podcast feed or on this YouTube channel if you're watching. And yeah, thanks for your support. Thanks for being here. As always, stay classy, Houston, and vamos, Texans. Thanks for tuning into The Bullpen, a Texans podcast, part of the Fans First Sports Network. Please like, comment, subscribe, and follow along for more Texans talk from The Bullpen.
Take the handoff. Stroud looking. Stroud